Hey there, and welcome to the Next Level Production instructional video. And in this instructional video, we're going to be talking about how to mix big sessions. For this video, I'm going to be using this great song by Krista Youngs called Mental Breakdown. And it was produced by Carlisle. Great production, great performance. This actually has a lot of tracks, and as I'm scrolling down, you can see not busy production, but definitely a lot of elements in this production. We're also going to be talking about certain routing that makes the mixing process easier, but for the most part, we're going to be talking about organization, how to organize all these tracks, how to make sense of so much information, and how not to get lost in all of these tracks. So before we dive actually into more technical details of mixing, I would like to maybe talk about a recent trend in mixing, and that is mostly based on the fact that our technology allows us to mix pretty much in the box. Nowadays, you have loop clouds, you have Splice, you have various websites where you can actually work with already processed samples. So by the time you're done with your production, you've already used information that has been processed. At the same time, most of the DAWs don't have any limitations as far as the number of tracks or the number of voices that can be used in production, which also allows producers to pretty much be free when it comes to amount of information that they want to include in their production. So if someone wants to use 15 tambourines, that's totally cool. It's possible. Each one of them can have a separate color. Each one of them can add something to the production. If we want to use 20 electric guitars, not a problem at all. Back in the days where we used to have a very limited amount of channels on the tape machine, it would be a problem because we would constantly have to bounce to 2 tracks so we can free up more tracks for recordings. In today's reality, this thing completely changed, and now we're given freedom to create the kind of production with unlimited amount of tracks. Mixing now and production, the difference between these two processes of song creation now become less and less noticeable, which makes it sort of more conceptual for the mixing engineer to work with, because for the most part, for example, with this song, when I got the tracks from the producer, they were extremely well delivered, but at the same time, most of them were already processed. And that's something to keep in mind, whether you're a mixing engineer, whether you're a producer working with a large amount of tracks. If you're mixing and you're getting it from the producer, it's extremely important to remember that these tracks are probably processed. And that's just something that you would have to listen to. Now, whether you're a mixing engineer or whether you're a producer, at the end, what's really important that before we start mixing, we have to sort of remember or make sort of a mental note to ourselves which tracks we actually do want to have processed and therefore delivered, already processed for the process of mixing, and which tracks we actually like to have raw and unprocessed, so that the mixing engineer can make its own decision as far as processing goes. And nowadays we have pretty much all the tools to create the kind of vision that a producer wants to create for the mixing engineer to then later perfect it and take it even a few steps further. And this mixing, in my opinion, differs a lot from more sort of traditional type of mixing where tracks would be recorded to tape and then later on mixing engineer would apply various processing and that would be called mixing. In this scenario, specifically with this song that we're going to be looking at, it is extremely important to understand the vision of the producer, because this vision is already pretty much done as far as the musical landscape, as far as the sonical landscape of the song goes. And I find this extremely important for the mixing engineer, because rather than creating a completely different sonic environment and by that stamping it with your sort of creative stamp, it is more important for the mixing engineer to tap into the producer's vision, since most of the tracks are already processed, and therefore when you hit the play, a lot of this material already sounds pretty mixed. Therefore, roughs are these days becoming more and more close to the final mixes, and some mix engineers even find it difficult beating the rough and making it sound better. I would probably say that it is very important to tap into the producer's vision. And if you're a producer and you're also the mixing engineer, then it makes it easier, because as a producer, you have all the tools to mix your own music. You would be mixing it as you go, I assume. But if you're a producer who hands the session later on to the mixing engineer, I would probably have also a few things that I would advise. First of all is make a clear distinction of what tracks you want to be processed, what tracks you don't want to be processed, what effects, creative effects would be printed with the audio, and what creative effects you would want the mixing engineer to decide on. All of these things, when you deliver your session to the mixing engineer, all of these things will make the mixing process much easier, and it will save you a lot of time if the mixing engineer gets the music bounced in a way that doesn't require a lot of going back and forth and trying to figure out how to process what to process. So if you have a specific delay throws, or if you have a specific radio effect that you've been working on, and then you decide to remove it, then the mix engineer would have to recreate these creative effects, and that can take a lot of time, for which I assume you would be financially responsible, and it's also gonna make the process much longer. And instead of paying attention to more crucial things in the mix, mix engineer would be required to tweak certain things to perfection, something that otherwise could have been printed with during the bounce. Another important thing that I would advise, when you do have a lot of tracks and you feel like you want to create these separate bounces for every single track, and that is totally fine if you want your mix engineer to have a complete freedom, which I suggest should be previously discussed as well. If you want to have your mix engineer have a complete freedom over 15 shakers, that is totally fine. But if there are elements that you absolutely 100% sure about, and if the balance of these elements is precisely the way you like it and the way you want it, I would highly recommend bouncing this to a stereo. Make sure that there's processing that you want that's applied to it, and this way you can actually reduce the amount of tracks that you send over to the mixing engineer. So in other words, one of the ways to really create a session that is easy to work with if you mix a lot of tracks is actually to make as little tracks as possible. And that has to do with further processing, that has to do with not losing certain tracks during the mixing process, that has to do with organization of the music, and at the same time with preserving what is important to the producer, and not letting the mix engineer waste its time to recreate certain things, things that could have been otherwise bounced together. Also, another thing that I found extremely important in this specific session is that every group actually, and the way I got it from the producer, every group had actually a bus channel, which means that there was probably a lot of parallel processing going on, and the bus channel, the auxiliary, where those tracks were routed to and where the processing was taking place, it was actually separately bounced, which I found extremely useful. So, like, for example, here we have drums and we have a drum bus. That gives me freedom to really add the kind of parallel compression that the producer had in mind, or maybe completely lose it if I don't like it. In this specific case, I really enjoyed the bus processing that was done by the producer. So if you do parallel processing, if you have certain buses that are already pre-assigned, they're part of your template, I encourage you to print them separately. And the same thing goes for certain reverbs or delays. Printing reverbs or delays, I find it extremely useful for two reasons. First of all, you get the dry signal for things. So if I find that certain reverbs or delays make things muddier, I can always introduce a different reverb or delay. And the second reason is when these two on the separate channel, you tend to process them better. You tend to attend to them and actually process them separately and customize them better, as if they were simply on an aux send, which you could do also on an aux send. But I find it more useful for those delays and reverbs to be printed, and that makes it easier maybe to chop them, maybe to apply certain effects to those effects. So that makes the process much easier. Also, another thing that I noticed that I liked in the bounces is to be able to play all of the tracks when you open them up in the new mixing session, and for the music not to clip. So, like here in Pro Tools, I have a master meter, and sometimes I get tracks where I played it. I absolutely have to lower them by 20 dB. I'm meaning the gain, and that makes it extremely difficult because it's going to be difficult to determine the dynamic range, and it's going to be difficult to bring the initial production to the level where it pumps right. So I would definitely encourage producers to make sure that the levels, when all the tracks are being imported for mixing, just maybe play them back and make sure that when you hit them and everything is at zero level, that the overall master level doesn't cross zero. And for that, you can gain control every track. As you can see, other than the buses, the tracks here are at the very good level, and I literally didn't really have to even gain reduce them as I usually do when I get certain tracks, maybe the bass tracks, but that's probably because of the distortion that would apply. Other than that, these tracks look perfect, and I didn't have to gain reduce any of them. As you can see, most of them are at the zero level, and this is the perfect bounce. This is the kind of bounce that you want to get from the producer. So that has something to do with organizing the headroom and making sure that the dynamic level is right to the point where my processing and my chain is not gonna really affect the pumping of the initial production, because if the tracks are extremely loud and I start mixing them, I would definitely have to reduce the gain, which would in turn make my processing act differently. So in order to avoid this, it is always better to keep the level minimal and to keep the gain structure perfect, so at 0. So when you play all of your tracks exported into the new session, the master level stays at 0 and nothing really distorts. And that it's a very important thing, and I can't really emphasize it enough. And that is definitely something that, for the mixing engineer, really determines how much work, how much time would actually be spent on recreating something, rather than actually initially have it delivered to you with the right gain staging, with the right gain level.